All right, here we are. I'm going to go ahead and intro the episode. We have the following written. After back-to-back terms of President Barack Obama, the Republican Party looked poised to turn in a new direction with the nomination of Donald Trump. However, many evangelical elites such as Rusell Moore, Timothy Keller, Francis Collins, and others balked and began to exert substantial effort over the coming years to convince evangelicals that voting for Democrats was acceptable and even necessary to stop Trump. Orange man bad. Now, new details reveal that this effort was not just an organic, conscientious objection to Trump's bombastic style, but a coordinated and well-funded effort among some of the evangelicals' most influential figures to propagandize millions of conservative Christians. Tune in now as we are discussing in this episode how Rusell Moore and Timothy Keller, as well as other names which will be mentioned throughout the episode, how they got evangelicals to vote for baby killers, aka Democrats. Wes, he wrote our article for this week. He's going to go ahead and line out a little bit of the overview of this episode, what we'll be discussing. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much. Good to be here again. So we'll talk about today the divide in evangelicalism that arose over Donald Trump, the behind the scenes. So behind the scenes, the money and the influence that actually went into manipulating the evangelical vote. And towards the end, Lord willing, we'll look at the year ahead. So it's election year again. I don't know about you guys. I'm pumped. 2020 front to back was just a ride. Yep. So it's so good to be back in election season. We've never been more back than we've been before.
Than we are right now.
It's going to be quite the year. Lord knows what's going to happen. Yep. Just a brief note, we had planned to talk about the dynamic of Christians and how they should relate to power. And so we are pivoting to this new news, some interesting stuff that's come out. But just really briefly to mention, I think you did a great job on Sunday talking about it. When we say how Christians should think about power, power is a tool. All right, so an axe can do an incredibly good thing for you. It can chop wood, it can help you build a home, or it could be used violently. Power should be thought of the same way. And there's many who would say, well, Christians, our ethos, our motive is to lay down power. Timothy Keller, he literally said one time, he said, it's in the nature of God to give up power and privilege. And so you'll be told by evangelical elite, you should give it up. You shouldn't seek to attain power. You shouldn't seek authority. You shouldn't seek control. But that's just not true. I would even say, like, to even be capable of virtue, I think of self-mastery. You have to have some level of control and power over yourself. That is a prerequisite to even being able to order your house well, much less making a difference in the world. So, Lord willing, we'll get into that topic some other time, do a full episode on it. But for this week, talking about Timothy Keller, Rusell Moore, other evangelical elites, how they got Christians, how they went after evangelicals to vote Democrat.
Right.
One quick note, wanted to add on this. Maybe you've never heard of Timothy Keller or Rusell Moore, for example. You would say, I don't know who these guys are. I've never read a book by them. Who are they and why should I care would be the bigger question. The way these kind of platforms work is that maybe you've never heard their name, but your pastor, for example, say your pastor balked over COVID or balked over Trump. He was probably listening to these guys. Right. Timothy Keller's influence, he's sold millions of books. It's almost diffused. And so their ideas and their thoughts and their ethics, they get absorbed to where they're almost the zeitgeist of the moment. Mm-hmm. They're almost, taken for granted because they're so influential.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's good. With the power thing, one of the things I wanted to note is even, with this episode, we are going to address that topic at least at some level, because what's interesting is that, a lot of the modern day evangelical elites, they want you, the plebe, to give up power. Mm-hmm. But notice Rusell Moore and Tim Keller, and Francis Collins and these guys, they're not leading by example. They're telling you to give up power, but they very much are wielding power. They have immense power, immense influence, and they're wielding all of it as much as they can in terms of influence and platform, but also in terms of dollars, and we'll get into that, funding, money, in order to secure a certain outcome, namely that evangelicals would vote for Democrats. So, and Tim Keller, he's got his, he has an explanation where he said, well, I was registered as a Democrat for these reasons, but it is public knowledge. You can look it up. I mean, he's passed away at this point, but he was registered publicly as a Democrat. And he has his explanation for that. I don't find it incredibly convincing, but you'd be surprised. Some of the major evangelical leaders, Tim Keller is not the only one, who are publicly registered as Democrats and have been for decades. So,
I feel like I should address too, on that note, I've had conversations with Christians who have said, why would you be so shocked and opposed to a Christian voting for a Democrat? Mm-hmm. And I think some of this mentality comes from, to be honest, I think it's a little bit uninformed, because the Democratic Party has, from its beginning, been a problem, a sinful problem of racism and anti-black freedom and segregationist, and also as far as even their monetary policies, I think were extremely misguided. But the Democrat, Republican, or the progressive conservative issues that we face now are clear moral issues. There's no way that we can say that voting for baby killers or people who advocate removal of body parts from so-called transgender children, or totally open borders, abdicating duties of nations, these are obvious bright lines, right? Where there is a right and a wrong on each side of them. And so in that sense, people need to realize that the political issues that we face are not really political issues. They are spiritual issues that are manifesting themselves in polls and elections, but they're clearly spiritual, moral, black and white issues.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so Wes, maybe kick us off with with our, as we open this up, the divide in evangelicalism since 2015, really leading up to the 2016 election. That was the moment where these guys give honor where honor is due. So Aaron Renn, he came out with an article where he was summarizing some of the findings. Do you remember the author of that book that he was? I forget the name. What is the name?
It's a book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicalism in an Age of Extremism, authored by, the man's name is Tim Alberta. Yep. Okay. I've skimmed the book itself. It's a pretty generic critique of how dare Christians, try to win back their country and push back against liberalism.
That's the point, right? The book's intention was not really to kind of expose evangelicalism, right? It was Aaron Renn who came in and kind of mined it for the data for what we're talking about today.
And what was some of that data? So like backing up all the way to 2015, there were meetings, right? So last week, it's funny, last week we talked about conspiracies.
Right.
And we didn't say there's no such thing as conspiracies. We just said, look, there's like, on any given day, there's a million conspiracies and 2 million on Sunday, and so we as finite creatures have to triage and and prioritize. And one of the things we talked about is what's going to actually affect me at home, right? Not just who shot JFK. Not to say that there's not a truth there, and not to say that there might not be a truth that goes against the history that we've been taught, but that truth, I'm sure it would have ripple effects and implications and things like that, even for us today, but probably not to the same degree as abortion affects today, or completely open borders, in a just a complete, invasion. That affects, especially for us living in Texas, those kinds of things. That affects our wives, our children, at another level. So with conspiracies, we're not saying that it's all just hogwash. We're saying no, some of these things really. They're real. There's something to it, and but we need to triage and pick the ones that are that hit closest to home. And otherwise, you can just lose yourself, and you don't have any time in the day to actually be with your own wife and kids because you're on some Reddit thread,
to
whatever.
Protect them.
Right, exactly. So we're not against conspiracies turning out to be true. Over the last few years, the difference between conspiracy and the truth is 3 to 6 months. And so so this is something that honestly, if it had been mentioned even just a couple of years prior, probably would have been viewed as a silly conspiracy. That a group of influential evangelical leaders are meeting together in person, right? Like almost like this regular. Lodge or something,
they term themselves the outsiders. They
outliers.
They had a name and everything.
Outliers? What is it? Okay. And so, yeah, they had a name for their group. They're meeting in person. Rusell Moore, it seems like, was brought in a little bit later, but
Yes.
he became a part of the group. But the implication is that Tim Keller and Francis Collins and some of these other guys, what was the name of the dude with the New York?
David Brooks is columnist for the New York Times.
Yeah.
So you're talking about like when you think of like the NIH, National Institutes of Health, of which Francis Collins was the director. Right. They have a $40 billion budget. So you have a massive government influence. David Brooks, New York Times columnist, massive traditional legacy media influence, one of the best-selling apologists and authors in Christendom, on the Presbyterian side especially, Timothy Keller. On the Baptist side, Rusell Moore, other attendees. And the date of it...
Because at that time, Rusell Moore was still SBC, head of the ERLC.
Yes, he was head of their ethics commission. They're meeting in 2015. Now, Trump didn't, of course, so we're in 2024 election year. We haven't even had any primaries yet. We don't know who will be the nominee. We have a good guess. I think you could warrant a guess for who it'll be. So they're meeting before Trump has even stood in a single primary. And what they're meeting about. So Bernie Sanders is a self-avowed, self-described Democratic socialist. He was on the ballot. Hillary Clinton, not a fan. Not a fan of evangelicals, not friendly to their policies. They're looking to be the next front runners up for the Democratic Party. So you had 2 years of Barack Obama, who he billed himself as a moderate. He tacked hard left. He tried to bill himself as this unifying, moderate, bring both sides together. He really wasn't that. So you had 2 years of really a pretty progressive president. I mean, 2015 was Obergefell versus Hodges, the legalization of same-sex marriage. So you had a rapid progressive influx of change, of cultural headwinds, 2015 going into 2016, and the object of their concern, what was it? Bernie Sanders, Clinton, no, it was Donald Trump. Somebody that had mean tweets on Twitter.
Possibly, even not specifically Donald Trump, but a conservative backlash to the leftward direction that the country had been going. Because like you say, Trump wasn't necessarily the guy. So they're already meeting, saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to push the evangelical vote towards a more progressive mindset?
Yes. Right, and this is coming off, this is during and then towards the end of 2 terms of Obama.
Correct.
So they're watching one of the most, or the most progressive president in American history, and they're saying, and their takeaway is not, we're concerned about this. Their takeaway is, we're concerned that this might stop.
Yep.
We're concerned that some ultra conservative guy might come in or whatever. So they're like, how can we stay in this?
What's going to happen to us as we steward the slow decline? Like these men, you can give your thoughts, but they almost seem like they're stewards. I think of the steward of Gondor.
Yep.
Right.
He was just holding the throne, not as a king, not to rule well, not to see a renewal, literally just to manage it slowly.
Abandon your post.
Yep. And then it comes down to it.
Yep.
Abandon ship.
Yep.
That's what these men almost remind me of. The ship is going out on the west. The sun is sinking. We're entering, it's probably going to be a tough couple, not just years, but decades ahead. And it looks like these men just wanted to keep the status quo above everything else. Not someone to change it up. Not someone to flip the table, even if it has some negatives. They just wanted to manage the slow decline of both evangelicalism. I mean, Rusell Moore, he said, let cultural Christianity die. But what a dumb thing to say. And what I want to get across, not all of them, but many of them, they hate the church.
Yeah.
And in a sense, God's people, they love nothing more than selling them out. I think of David French with the New York Times. He's getting his thousands of dollars to write against good, salt of the earth Christians, to sell them out, to put them on blast, to make them look silly. These people don't love God's church. They don't love him. They don't love his people.
Yep. And when it becomes so obvious that they can't even deny the ways that they have harmed Christians throughout the entirety of the country, it's there's not deep repentance, there's not deep remorse, there's not sorrow, there's not a sense of like, oh my goodness, I hurt the people of God who I love. Right? David says, speaking of the saints, he says they are the excellent ones in all the earth, in whom my soul delights. Like he delights in the people of God, he loves them. But Francis Collins, recently, the reaction is not godly sorrow leading to repentance and deep remorse for how you hurt the people of God. The reaction is, whoops. Turns out, we were thinking about how COVID would affect, New York City, that's densely populated, and these kinds of things. We didn't think about, Ohio. We didn't think about Kansas. We didn't think about, we weren't thinking about rural areas, and turns out, but here's the thing. It's like, you weren't thinking about it, but there were hundreds of people that were, and we screamed
we were saying so.
at you, and you heard us. You looked us in the face. You heard. You knew. And we know you know because that you heard what we were saying because you mocked us and told us to shut up and deleted the emails and ran a campaign against us. And but like plenty of people so you weren't thinking about this. Well, plenty of people were, and they put it on your radar to where you were thinking about it and you didn't care because at the end of the day, that blue collar conservative salt of the earth Christian in Kansas doesn't matter as much as the person in New York City in your mind, right? Like these are people who they love the chief seats. And they love the people who can put them in the chief seats. Flyover country doesn't matter to them because these are just Neanderthals, as Joe Biden said. Like our president. They hate you. They hate the salt of the earth, blue collar Christian. And back to the conspiracy type thing, like. Maybe we'll get into the Illuminati one day, but I think it's absolutely hits home, right? It's absolutely something that's right on the nose and relevant for us as Christians and our families, our wives, our children, our local churches to talk about maybe not the Illuminati, but sadly the evangelical version of it, a group that literally has a name that meets in person and did so for years during Obama's 2 terms and says, this is not our big concern. Our big concern is this stopping with Orange Man Bad because he has mean tweets. And how can we leverage our influence, not just ours, but with Francis Collins and and the New York Times and how can we leverage all cash, money, influence, books, sermons, conferences, the whole 9 yards to keep going in a political direction that murders babies, that eventually will trans kids, and that's what we should focus on.
But gets us popular for about 10 years.
Yep.
You'll get popular. The rest of the world will suffer in the coming decades. But you'll have your moment. You'll have your moment in the spotlight.
Right.
Absolutely.
What is it? Ezekiel, it's 36 or maybe 37, where it talks about, wicked shepherds. And I know we'll get into John 10, the good shepherd, the hired hand. But like Ezekiel 36 or 37, it says that, God is angry with the shepherds of Israel because they don't care for the sheep. They just eat the sheep. Yep. That's all that, they're getting fat off of, the slaughtering the sheep, eating the sheep, but they don't actually care for the sheep. And I feel like that's, Tim Keller, God rest his soul. We're not trying to pick on a guy, who died, somewhat recently, but Tim Keller did some good things for the Lord early on. I think he had some good things, but his last at least decade of his pastoral tenure was wicked.
Yeah,
it was bad.
It wasn't suited for, some others have pointed this out, the negative world. You think if there was a world where Christianity was a positive thing, I think leading up to about 2008, he terms it. Then there's a world where being a Christian was, it wasn't a knock on you, but it wasn't necessarily like, I want to hire this good Christian, hardworking young man. And then we've really entered since about 2014, 2015. Aaron Red would say this. This isn't my takeaway, but the negative world, a world where it's a negative mark. You're looking for a job or you're looking for an appointment. Oh, you're a Christian? You believe in conservative values? You believe marriage is one man and one woman? Ooh, you're not quite what we're looking for. And Keller was not suited for that negative world where it costs something. Many others too. Not suited for a world where they couldn't keep their place at the high table, their seat in the reputable market. They couldn't have their cushy seminary appointments, and it's being revealed. Right. The cover's off. We now see what they really were. Right.
All right. Let's go ahead and cut to a commercial real quick, and then we'll come right back.
The danger of centralized power is often represented by the word king. As Americans, we hate the word king. Civilian ownership of body armor is about helping people to have increased power to resist tyrants and criminals. And so, Armored Republic is about helping you to preserve your God-given rights to the honor of the Lord Jesus Christ, because he is the King of Kings, and he governs kings and he will judge them. This is Armored Republic, and in a republic, there is no king but Christ. We are free craftsmen, and we are honored to be your armorsmith of choice.
Finally, a coffee company that doesn't hate you and your beliefs. Today's sponsor, Squirrely Joe's Coffee, is a thoroughly Christian company that ships seriously good coffee straight to your front door. Owned and operated by Joe Morris and his family out of Olney, Illinois. They believe that Christians should be building a thoroughly Christian economy by doing business with other like-minded Christians. Just go to squirrelyjoes.com and use promo code RRM for 20% off your purchase. Squirrely Joe's Coffee, share coffee, serve humbly, live faithfully. Wow. All right, we're back. So we're going to pick up now, real quick, before we move on to segment 2. Let's just briefly cover the post-war consensus, because that's a term that keeps getting thrown out there, and a lot of people probably don't actually know what it means. Could you explain a little bit of that, Wes? And then I've got a couple things I can add.
Yes, absolutely. So we talk about like Trump's mean tweets. The deeper reason underneath that, like we live in a post-World War II culture. The sky is blue, the grass is green, and World War II has deeply affected just about everything about this world that we live in. That's just the fact of the day. Something that came out of World War II. So we saw the absolute destruction from Russia, from Europe, from Japan, even on our borders to some degree. And the idea that came out of this, you can trace this in writings, you can trace this in academia, is that these strong, ardent, I just want to say passions, love for religion, love for family, love for nation, that these things can motivate us to do terrible things.
They're dangerous.
They're dangerous. Now, true virtue orders them rightly. Our first love is God. Our second love is family. Our third love, nation, is on the list, for example. We order them rightly, so we don't put nation above God and do terrible things. But the post-war consensus is this idea that to avoid, again, a World War II, a World War I, the atrocities that happened, to avoid that, what we need to do is we need to create a culture where our values are inclusion, our values are diversity, our openness. We need to divulge ourselves, push down these ardent loves for family, for blood, for soil, for nation, for all these things in their own right that are good. We need to push those down and instead exalt a place where diversity and inclusion. And so to that end, the strong man, a strong leader who says, for example, Trump was very strong on immigration. We need to keep our borders secure. Immigration needs to be carefully vetted, so we're letting in the right people that were benefiting our nation. Rhetoric like that sounds a lot like fascism from World War II. And so that's where that idea came from. Is like,
well, and that's why the media constantly tied, Trump to Hitler.
Yep.
Right. So so that is the post-war consensus. And just a couple things I would add to that is like, one, when we say the strong man, we're not saying in Hitler being kind of like the quintessential example of that. We're not saying that Hitler was truly, according to biblical definitions, a strong man. So we're not saying internally and in terms of matter of the soul, at a spiritual level that he was a strong man. Hitler was a Christian. He was regenerate and he was godly. And we're not. That's not what we mean. And in the same way with Trump, because I could see the objection coming. The counter would be Trump, strong man. He tweets like a 14-year-old girl. What what's strong about that? Whatever. But when we say strong man, what we mean by that is in terms of his policies. And I would argue for his first 3 years being much better than his last year, and a lot better than some of his rhetoric now. Some of it I like, some of it I'm like, oh come on, dude, you're gonna position yourself to the left of DeSantis, dumb. That's dumb. But Trump does some dumb things. But all that being said, the point is, when we say strong man, we don't mean strong like Jesus, truly strong by biblical definitions. But we're just saying strong opposed to weak. So R.R. Reno would probably be the guy. So that's a book recommendation that I want to throw out there for our listeners. Yep. Definitely, I would say 2 biggest books for me for 2023 that were really helpful was Defenders of the West, Abraham. What's his first name? I forget. Something Abraham. But Defenders of the West, it's chronicling, the Crusades, but not super heady and historical. He takes 8 of the most famous crusaders, Richard the Lionheart and Duke Gregory, and these guys. What's his name? Ferdinand, Spanish king, and he says, all right, these guys, this is what they did. This is how they honored the Lord. The Crusades, you've been lied to with revisionist history. They're not as bad as you would think, and that's kind of in the same frame as the second book that I read, of my two favorite books from last year, was R.R. Reno. I'm not saying they were published last year, but I read them. R.R. Reno, Return of the Strong Gods. And when he says the strong gods, super helpful. When he says the strong gods, he's not talking about pagan gods like Thor. He's saying the strong gods being lowercase g gods. Patriarchy would be one. It's basically everything in line with nature. That which is, is natural order. So patriarchy opposed to egalitarianism, feminism. And then nationalism as opposed to globalism. Yes. So at all these different levels, religion as opposed to secularism and materialism, Darwinianism, tradition as opposed to modernism, modernity. And so he's saying these are the strong gods. And what he means by that is not that they're actually deities, but he's just saying these are the traditions and the grid, the mold, the system that has sustained humanity for thousands of years. And then the weak gods would be the opposite of all those things. So instead of a strong national sense of loyalty, fidelity, and even pride in the right sense of the term, it could be a bad pride, but it could also be a good pride. It's not inherent. Nationalism doesn't have to be inherently bad. It could be a good version of nationalism or a bad version. But the alternative is globalism, that nations just get steamrolled into one global order. It's the WF, think George Soros and those kind. For patriarchy, it would be feminism. For religion, again, secularism would be the weak god. And to sum up the weak gods as opposed to the strong gods, it would be inclusivism. Inclusivism. And the way that you get inclusivism is by going against transcendent, absolute, universal truth. So anyone who is saying there is a standard above us, even if they're not pointing to the Christian standard, it could be Islamic nationalism, right? Islamic patriarchy, right? So there are different versions of the strong gods. I believe there are Christian versions. I believe there are pagan versions. I believe there are Islamic versions, and all these different things. But anybody who would stand up and say, you know what, strong male leadership is a good thing. Feminism has done a number, and we don't need it, or nations are a good thing. We don't want one global order. America is for America. America first. Make America great again. Or anybody who would say, religion is a good thing. Traditions of old is a good thing. That would be someone who is a strong man. Again, internally he might be weak, but a strong man using strong rhetoric, advocating for the strong gods. And my whole thing over these past couple of years, if you want to know if you want to know Joel Webbin's shtick, that's basically underlining all the videos, is I'm convinced that Reno is right. And I was convinced before I even read his book. I didn't have all the rhetoric that he's used, and that's been helpful. But I feel like there's a return to the strong gods, and I feel like a lot of evangelicals, even some of the good guys, so I'm not talking about like Tim Keller and Rusell Moore types, but I'm talking about, mid-Eva types that are in the Reformed camp that are mostly conservative and mostly biblical, mostly faithful. I feel like what they're trying to do right now is, I call it the Gandalf move, right? So that you've got the Balrog on the one hand, and you've got the, Frodo and the ring and, and the Fellowship of the Ring over here, and they need to be protected, and there's a bridge in between, and Gandalf's going to go to the middle of the bridge, standing between that which needs to be protected and, the threat, and, do the "you shall not pass." And I think that that's kind of what Tim Keller did. And I see other guys doing that too. Now they're doing it with better biblical language, and they're doing it, I don't want to put them in the same category as Tim Keller, because they are more faithful than Tim Keller, at least, end of life Tim Keller, last 20 year Tim Keller. But it's still the same strategy of, right now it's like we're in feminism. We don't want people to go back, swing the pendulum. They see it as an overswing. So we don't want it to overswing all the way to patriarchy, because that's bad. So we're going to stand in the middle of the bridge with the Balrog and say, "You shall not pass," not feminism, not patriarchy, complementarianism, or we're going to stand in the middle and say, like, yes, you can care about America, but not too much, so not nationalism, but being patriotic, because that's okay, but nationalism is terrible, or so at every level. And bottom line, that dog won't hunt. I think that that's not going to work out. So what I think is all the evangelical leaders in mid-Eva right now doing the Gandalf move, trying to stand in the middle and say, "You shall not pass." I think America, it's inevitable. I think R.R. Reno's right. It's just going to jump right over them. And they're all going to go back. So I think the actual move of Christian leaders should not be trying to carve out a middle way, which is that is Tim Keller summed up in a nutshell. And I think, again, medieval, I'm not putting them in the same category because I think they're carving out a better middle way, but I think it's still a middle way. So it's a better third way, maybe it's a fourth way, whatever you want to call it. And fourth way is better than third way in this whole analogy that I'm painting, but it's still another way. I think that the feminism to patriarchy, that return, inevitable. Globalism to nationalism, inevitable. And so for me, instead of standing in the middle and say, well, don't do patriarchy or feminism, do complementarianism, a rich theology that's been around since 1988, I don't think that's the best move. Instead, what I want to do is I want to get all the way over here where everybody's going anyway, and where I think we're supposed to go, where I think God wants us to go. And what I want to say is everybody's going to come back to patriotism or patriarchy, and everybody's going to come back to nationalism, and everybody's going to come back to tradition, and everybody's going to come back to all these things because this works. This sustains societies. But what I want to do is I want to come over here and say there is a transcendent, true Christian biblical version of all these things. So these guys are standing in the middle, and maybe you hold off the Belrog for a little bit, the Belrog being the masses, and you're trying to hold them off from what you see as an overcompensation, overswinging the pendulum. Maybe you hold them off for a little bit, but I don't think that this strategy will work. Eventually, all you can do is you can impede. I think you can stall, but you will not hold them off inevitably. And then once they hop over you, you know what they're going to do? They're going to go from feminism. You slow them down with your alternative of complementarianism. Maybe you slow them down for 5 years, but eventually they red pill faster, past complementarianism, and then they go over here to patriarchy. But all the Christians have said complementarianism is the Christian option. So when they skip and they say, well, complementarianism doesn't have teeth, it's weak, it doesn't make sense of the world. I see these gaping holes. It makes some sense, but then there's no answer to this question and this question. Then they go over here and they say, well, patriarchy, that one actually makes sense, but there's actually no Christian version of patriarchy because all the Christians opted for this Gandalf middle road. And so when they get into patriarchy land, what are their options? Islamic patriarchy, Andrew Tate patriarchy, but I repeat myself, Rollo Tomasi patriarchy, it's Joe Rogan, patriarchy, and so there's nothing but non-Christian options. Same with nationalism. So it's like, well, be patriotic, but nationalism is bad because Hitler was bad and he was a nationalist, and maybe that holds people off for a while, but then they realize again there's problems with that, and then they hop over here, and again your only options. All the Christians opted for this middle way, so there's no Christian option, no significant Christian influence and leaders over here, and so when they land into nationalism, they're actually more likely to say, well, hey, maybe Hitler wasn't so bad, and so what I'm trying to say is, no, let's get over here. Christian nationalism, Christian biblical patriarchy, biblical tradition, biblical, and just skip to the punch, and doing it because that's where the people are headed. But I don't want it to sound like that's the only motive. That is a motive, but it's not even the chief motive. The chief motive is, I believe this is what the Bible teaches, and I want to be obedient to God. Yes. So all that being said, the post-war consensus is embracing the weak gods of inclusivism. You can do that with statements, with ideas, right? So there is no transcendent truth. You could be right, your truth. Right? Truth becomes relative. So weak in terms of just truth in general, weak on borders. It's not nations, it's globalism. It's not patriarchy, it's feminism. It's not capitalism, it's socialism. It's not like at every single level, it's weak. And when I say weak, think weak as being synonymous in this framework with inclusivism. Include. And it's because the last guy who made strong dogmatic claims, well, that dude was Adolf Hitler. And you don't want that. And that's where we've been, not just in America, but in the West. The post-war consensus is basically the argument that for at least 60 years, if not longer, but at least the last 60 years, we have all, even if we're not conscious of it, we've all subtly given our consent to some degree or another that strength, especially strength in a man in a position of power, is bad. The populist is bad. And then all we did was the evangelical version of that is we just wrap that in Christianese.
So I have something I want to say about that, and then I'm going to pivot us back to getting into the funding behind that. Because I think that what we see going on with the evangelical not power plays, but what we're talking about with your article today, Wes, is a result of the post-war consensus. And what I want to say, I've been thinking about what you said just now a lot, Joel. And in some ways, we being the church, we are in a unique position because the deconstructionists and the post-war weakness has kind of destroyed a lot of presuppositions. People don't have a presupposition about morality, except that it's not there. People don't even have a presupposition about gender anymore, right? And so we actually, if we, the church, will take advantage of the time that God has put us in, we will rebuild these things in a godly way. We will, like gender has just been assumed as an order of creation. Praise the Lord. That's been how it is for all of history. But rarely has there been a time in history where gender is grounded in the lordship of Christ, or where national duty is grounded in what the Scripture objectively teaches. It's been the default strong position, but we, the church, and we're losing it because people are going to Andrew Tate, and they're going to Jordan Peterson, and they're going to this or that, and it should be the church informing people what it means to live and to have the proper loves that God has given to us. Now,
good,
that being the case, I want to read a quote because it's so interesting to me. In 2008, WEF in Davos, they invited Rick Warren to go and speak. And Rick Warren started his talk by saying something along the lines of, there are these great issues that humanity faces that no single nation has been able to tackle. And he listed pandemics, he listed poverty, he listed, economic inequity, things like this. And he said, because we haven't been able to tackle these to this point, it behooves us to partner together. And what he meant was international government forces, international business, and international religious movements. Okay? And this is what he said. He said, there is a role for the public sector. There's a role for the private sector. There was a role for the faith sector. And then he says the governments or the UN ought to set the policy for what needs to be tackled globally. Then he said the enterprise, the commerce, the business sector needs to kind of come up with new ingenious ideas of tackling problems. And then this is what he said the role of the church in this open, post-war kind of global neighborhood world is. He says, but then also, houses of worship have things that businesses and government will never have. In the first place, we have universal distribution. The church was global 200 years before Davos started talking about globalization. And then he said, we have 2,000 years of credibility where we can tell our people to go do this because the government told us and they will believe us. He handed the WEF the credibility of the church and the goodwill of the regular average person sitting in the pew, the blue-collar Christian, and said, these are totally at your disposal. And if we wanted to, that was 2008. That was even before the Rusell Moore. Yep, that was Rick Warren. It was Rick Warren.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah. Not shocked. Sad, but not shocked.
Yep.
All right. Wes, pick it back up with segment 2 now. Evangelical elite saw Trump as the biggest threat and the dark money funded years of propaganda. Let's get into some of that.
Yes. So 2016, Trump is elected. They did not just take their ball and go home. Well, we had a good run. We tried to dissuade the evangelical vote. They came out actually at a little bit stronger level than they had even in the past. And so it wasn't effective, at least in the short term. However, these initiatives, so aimed at educating evangelicals, aimed at persuading the vote, aimed at political engagement, they continued. And so 2020, obviously COVID happened. And what we actually see, Aaron Wren revealed this, is that Curtis Chang is a good example. He's an individual that's a consultant. David French. They began getting together and forming these initiatives. And what they did is they actually went to Christians, first of all.
They were looking for funding.
Right. They were looking for funding. They went to Christians and said, hey, could you fund this? We want to put
this
together.
Is David Chang, Rusell Moore.
Curtis Chang, Rusell Moore, and David French.
Curtis Chang.
They wanted to put together a curriculum for Christians. So go to Christians. Will you fund this? And they said, no, we're not interested in funding this. And so they actually went to the secular investors. Secular investors, he said, all of them said yes. Then you got into, obviously, COVID and the vaccines. Well, the government paid individuals, one of them being Curtis Chang and others, money, undisclosed sums, to put out videos to aim to convince communities of faith to get vaccinated. Another example of this, I lived in New Jersey at the time. I saw events. I have screenshots. There was these events being held called Grateful for the Shot. Food, fun, games, vaccines. being held at Hope of Dominion and Glory.
Vaccines administered at
The site.
event?
So come to the
at
site.
a church?
Yes. Come to the site. Come to our church. Listen to some music. Play some games. We're grateful for the shot being paid by the New Jersey Department of Public Health to hold these events. And so we talked about influence, obviously, backroom 2015, but that continued to grow. And just 2020 election, there's a lot of issues with it. But I mean, Biden was elected, and it's not unthinkable to think that 5 years of telling Christians, this man is terrible. Trump is awful.
Of these evangelical leaders telling Christians.
Yes, right. These evangelical leaders telling Christians, Trump's terrible. How could you do this? How could you support him? That it finally saturated the ground enough that in 2020, at the very least, they stayed home. Maybe they voted against him. I'm sure many did. Or they at least stayed home. And now we see where we are.
And just didn't vote at all. Yeah, totally. Yep. Yeah, and that's not to mention, rigging an election and mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting and all. Yeah, exactly. And machines, just accidentally, saying, oh, this was a pile for Biden, So there's all those things as well. But aside from, the freest and safest and surest election of all time, absolutely. Like, let's just say that the election was 100%, legit, which, again, if you believe that, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. But let's say it's 100% legit. Well, just at a human level, Biden could have won by just by knocking out the evangelical voting bloc, or at least weakening its legs, hamstringing it. And who did that? Evangelical leaders. Rusell Moore, guys, absolutely. And one more name to add to the list, sadly. God's used him in many ways. I'm grateful for him. And I wouldn't put him in the same category as Rusell Moore, Tim Keller, those guys. But John Piper, he should be mentioned. John Piper, one of the articles that he wrote, before the election, right before the election. And so it was pivotal. I mean, he was trying to influence Christians to do something in regards.
Right before the election.
Yeah, it was right before the election. And John Piper has massive influence.
And he had stayed out of it the whole time.
Exactly. He was doing great. Yep. John Piper he really is great in a lot of ways. Terrible on politics, though. He's just bad on politics. He just needs to stay out. But he wrote this article right before the election. He has massive influence with a ton of Christians. And I just can't believe this didn't affect how at least some people voted. I bet you that some people, just like Wes said, either said, well, then I guess I'm just not going to vote at all, or I'm going to, vote for third party.
Too complicated.
Or I'm going to, whatever. Or maybe even that was the nail in the coffin, like add that to, all the work that Rusell Moore and Tim Keller have been doing. And it, we just conjured another Christian vote for Biden. The conscience, the Christian is sitting there, and knowing I can't vote for a guy who's the most pro-abortion president, of history. Like, surely I can't. But Tim Keller assuaging the conscience a little bit, Rusell Moore assuaging the conscience, and then John Piper, and of all people, who's always been a defense of the unborn for decades, but then assuages the conscience, puts the finishing touches, and this is how he did it. He didn't do it by saying, abortion isn't bad. He didn't minimize the evils of abortion, but what he did was he, in my assessment, in this article, he wrongly maximized, increased the evils of a nasty Twitter account. And he put them on par. This was essentially, I'm summing up the article. This is not verbatim. It's not a quote. But in summary, I think this is fair. He said, we know that Biden's bad because we know abortion is bad. It's murder. And he didn't pull that punch. It's murder. And murder is really, really bad. But you know what else is bad? Arrogance, pride. And you know what? That's maybe harder to measure because we can look at exact numbers, annually of, through Planned Parenthood and through this and through that and see like how many babies have been killed, and it's maybe harder to quantify the effects of arrogance, but arrogance when it's in the highest office in the land, namely the Oval Office, and it's millions of people are seeing, your attitude and your rhetoric and your this, well, that could lend towards further division, and division could lend towards factions, and that could lend towards riots, and that could, and that can lend towards, this and that and the other, and all these negative effects, and you know what? That's really bad too. And he pretty much just left it there, and he didn't say, of course, he didn't say, so therefore, vote for Biden. He didn't say that, but the whole purpose of the article was it said we definitely shouldn't vote for Biden, but I'm here to tell you that there's just as much reason not to vote for Trump, and I guarantee you that a bunch of people that year just decided not to vote. Now, here's the gaping hole in Piper's argument. The gaping hole is what I would say is he created a false dichotomy, because what he's implying is this: on the one hand, you have murder. On the other hand, you have pride. But what that assumes is that there is actually such a thing as a humble murderer. That Joe Biden, because what he's assuming there is that Trump is arrogant, but here's the implication. He's arrogant and Biden is not, right? So on the one hand, you have, and what's the absence of arrogance and pride? So you have a humble baby killer, and then you have a arrogant, prideful non-baby killer. And what I want to say is that you cannot be pro-abortion apart from pride. What radical arrogance. So all you're talking about at this point is not pride versus murder, because there's no way that you can argue that the most pro-abortion president in our history is somehow humble. Yeah, right. You have to have pride to do that. It is by nature a prideful position. And so they're both prideful. All you're talking about is tone. But that works with evangelicals because that rhetoric had been worked for so many years by this point. The tone police, tone. Every gospel coalition, every other article, tone. Well, it's not what you said, but it's how you said it. It's your tone, it's your rhetoric, and so then Trump comes in and he's got an abrasive tone, I'll admit. And so boom, we were ready to say, you know what? We've got one president who kills babies and another who has bad tone on Twitter. And really, who's to say which is worse? All right, let's pause for a second, go to our final commercial break, and then we'll come back. Would you like to get control of your money and set up a system that will guarantee for the rest of your life tax-protected compounding interest and growth? How about having 24/7 electronic access to your money for funding wisely chosen investments, home improvements, and other large expenditures without going to the mainstream banks? This is not a dream, but it could actually be a reality when working with our sponsor, Private Family Banking. See their contact information in the show notes below. To make this season even brighter, Private Family Banking is giving away a pair of tickets, a $500 value, for the upcoming Blueprints for Christendom 2.0 conference, which is taking place on March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 2024 in Taylor, Texas. To enter the ticket giveaway, join their email list by sending an email to banking@privatefamilybanking.com. Again, that's banking@privatefamilybanking.com with the subject line of your email saying tickets. Then include your full name and mailing address in the body of the email. The ticket giveaway entry period will end at midnight Central Time on February 13th, 2024. And the winner will be notified via email on February 14th. You must be 18 years of age or older to enter, and only one email per person can be entered into this giveaway drawing.
All right. So we're back, and here's the deal.
So
this isn't just we're back more than we've ever been.
Yeah.
We have another election coming up. This isn't just, man, this happened in the past. That's terrible. They're gonna try, at least at some level, the same thing again. So I think about COVID. COVID did a great job. We talked about this, but it disrupted specifically for mail-in ballots for the purpose of voting in a non-traditional way that lended to disinterested voters being registered to vote, getting out the vote. So we've got another election year coming up. Probably even, I would say even more is on the line than it's been. And so there's a couple principles for Christians to keep in mind. You're thinking through voting, hopefully praying about it somewhat. One of the big ones is don't overcomplicate it. Don't overcomplicate voting. Commit it to the Lord. I think of the different neighbors to think of, because the first commandment, love God. Love him with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So you're thinking about voting. Well, how should I vote, and how should I process through the different ways to think about this? Your unborn neighbor. My brother is in the military, for example. I don't want him going to another war that started. 2 wars have started on Biden's watch.
Yep.
There was no wars during Trump's watch.
Not a coincidence.
Think about your neighbor. Think about your family member in the military. Think about fathers trying to feed their families, trying to put food on the table. These are some of the principles that Christians should say, like, wait, I want to love my neighbor well. I can do it in a small part, admittedly, in a small part with my vote. Those are some of the things to think about. Your neighbor, loving them, and loving them well.
Yep. So voting does matter. Unfortunately, our system, I think, is flawed in many ways. But we have a 2-party system, and Jesus is never on the ballot, and so we're dealing with finite men. and not just finite but fallible, fallen men, and so it is in many ways a lesser of two evils. Now, I think that's we were talking before we started recording offline a little bit. I think that's why at a large level that primaries really matter.
Yes.
So if you're, because on one hand, Michael was saying this earlier. Wes and I were talking about voting for the lesser of the two evils, and I think that is the way to go when it comes to a general election. But there is a certain level. Michael brought this up that if we'll always vote for the lesser of two evils, no matter how evil that lesser of the two evils is. Then what that tells, the GOP is it just gives them a free pass and says, all you have to do is be a little less evil, or at least, detectably less evil than the DNC candidate. And so it gives them a free pass to impunity with immorality. And so I think, the primaries is where we go out and we say, no, this guy is not going to win the primary. He doesn't get to make it to the general because he's degenerate. So that's, I think, where evangelicals can pull on the levers of power that we have and say, no, the most Christian candidate. So that's where we can really work, and then also I think at the local level, local elections, those kind of things. I think of Dusty Devers in Oklahoma, state senator, as a Christian nationalist, and people are like, you can't run on that platform and win. But he did. Now, it does help that it was Oklahoma, but God bless him, he did. And that's a start. That's what we need. And that's a good start. Dusty is awesome. He's a friend, and he's doing great things. And so that's where I think Christians can say, no, this guy. So in the primaries, working with that, and then local elections. In the general election, I really do think you vote for the lesser of two evils in love for neighbor. So one of the ways that I want to love my neighbor is for my neighbor not to be killed. And if one guy, because of his policies, is going to kill 1 million of my neighbors, and the other guy is going to kill 500,000, well, that guy who's going to kill 500,000, he's not righteous. But I can love 500,000 neighbors by keeping them alive by voting for that guy. And I think I have an obligation to do so. So all that being said, what we want to get into now, this is, I think, the most fun part of the episode that Wes planned for us, and I've got lots of speculations, but I'll throw it to you guys first. But what we want to get into is it's an election year.
Yep.
It's 2024, and so black swan events they seem like they're random, but they're not. Just like COVID, it was not a coincidence that it was 2020. And so what do we foresee? We don't have a crystal ball. We're not prophets or the son of a prophet. So these are not predictions that we're putting our name on, saying this shall come to pass. Thus saith the Lord. None of that. But I do think that there's something to be said for just being wise and looking ahead. So we're looking ahead not as experts, but as generalists, and saying it's an election year. It's a heated, contested election. There's a lot on the line for the regime in both parties, because there, at some level there is just in our nation, just at this point, controlled opposition, right? The GOP, most of it is just controlled opposition underneath the overarching regime that's trying to plunge us into, this global, world, one world order that's just progressive, degenerate, lizard people. So that's, I think I acknowledge that. Trump, I don't even think, obviously he wouldn't be an elder in our church, but I don't even think he could be a member in our church. We believe in regenerate church membership. We're Baptist, 1689. And, I would sit down to him and talk to him. And I'm not saying God alone sees the heart. Man looks at the outward appearance. But from what I've seen, not only do I not think he's a mature Christian, I don't even know if I could say that he is a Christian at all. But all that said, one thing I like about Trump is that I don't think that he's a part of the regime. I don't think he's the control. Trump was not supposed to happen. That's why they lost their minds in 2016. Is it was like this, like we for years, it was they gave us two options: the option we want and the option we don't want, but he's still our guy, right? You can have the progressive degenerate guy, or the guy who's conserving the progressive degenerate things that were done 15 minutes ago.
That's right.
But they're both actually our guys. They're both within the machine. And Trump, again, so this is not like Trump is some awesome godly guy. This is just to say he wasn't a part of the regime. And do I think he could have done more? Yes. But do I think he did more than any other Republican president in my lifetime? Also, yes. Yeah. So all that being said, you got Trump right now as the forerunner for the primary with the GOP, and it's an election year. And we know what stunts they pulled last year with mail-in voting and ballot harvesting and all these things under the banner, of COVID. 2024, you're foolish. So again, no crystal ball, no prophecies, but we're foolish if we don't at least think of possibilities, reasonable possibilities. It is not going to be a smooth year. It is going to be a crazy year. But what I want to say is, here's a little bit of a white pill Wednesday. When I say it's going to be a crazy year, I don't mean it's all bad. I think there's going to be some awesome positive. So I've got some predictions, but let's start with you guys. Black swan events, and then also some positive predictions. Let's talk about it.
I do want to say, when we're thinking about black swan events, and I have one potential, but in general, in my opinion, they fall into two categories, and both are an appeal to emotion. One is an appeal to fear, like COVID was, right? Stay home, don't go out, don't do anything, shut everything down, you're all going to die, right? That's an appeal to emotion, but specifically to the emotion of fear. Mm-hmm. The second one is an appeal to the emotion of empathy, right? And so that leads me to one that God forbid it happen, but since borders and nationalism are such an issue, I think it's possible that there could be some sort of disaster among immigrants here in America, right? Where some person is painted as a some sort of nationalist or even Christian nationalist who does violence towards immigrants, or some disaster at the border where a bunch of them die trying to cross, or of thirst out in the desert, something like that. And this gets used as an appeal to the emotion of empathy. See, if we just opened the border, if we were just giving them citizenship, if we were just giving them all the things that they needed or wanted, none of that would happen. And those of you who are voting in any way in a sort of nationalistic pride sense, you really should be not even just not voting, but should be marginalized and put on the fringes of society. So that's one I have.
That's good.
Yeah.
Wes?
I think it's important to remember too, the margins we're talking about, they're really very small. It's really about 4 battleground states, and the deciding vote in those is probably under 100,000. I think in the last election it was something like 79,000.
It was less than that.
We're not talking about millions.
Yeah, it was
of
actually,
votes.
I thought it was like 76 or something. But when I ran the numbers again, it was actually 46.
Yeah.
It was under 50,000 in terms of swing. So what you're talking, there were 7 primary swing states that were contested, close calls. And Biden, no, it was like 11 actually. And Biden got 7 out of the 11 or 12, something like that. It was like 10 to 12, and Biden got 7 of them. And out of the 7 that Biden got that turned blue, barely, if Trump had only gotten 4 of those, or it might have been 3, it was like 3 or 4 of those, then he would have won at the the presidency at the Electoral College. And those 3 or 4 states that he would have had to win, the margins and the popular vote of each of those states collectively was less than 50,000. So, and then to put just a little bit of more application on here, can't help myself, but I wrote a book called Fight by Flight. Get out of California, commie California. But 6 million votes for Trump in California.
Right.
And so it was really close. California's coming around. Nope. 12 million for Biden. Not even close. But my point is 6 million votes for Trump in California. And to my shame, I was one of them because we left California in December of 2020. And so just absolutely, just flushing your vote down the toilet if you're voting for Trump, in California, or voting for, any conservative in California. But my point is, at the national level, outside of just the state, at the national level, it came down to 3 or 4 pivotal states, swing states, going for Biden, and collectively 50,000. So 6 million wasted votes for Trump in one state, namely California, and 50,000 is all you needed. Now 50,000, you take that, it's actually 1%, right? So 6,600,000 would be 10%, 60,000 would be 1. So less than 1%. If less than 1% of conservative Christian residents in California had chose to leave the state before November 2020 and move to one of these 3 or 4 states respectively and cast their vote there, you would have had a Trump presidency instead of a Biden presidency, even with all the shenanigans being played. You'd have 13 U.S. service members, very likely still living, that died in Afghanistan. You probably would not have Putin's invasion with Ukraine. Very likely would not have some of the stuff going on in the Middle East with Hamas and Israel. You would not have some of the policies that have been crammed down. I mean, it's in real terms. It would be more loving for our neighbors. And first, in triage our neighbors here because we are obligated to them first,
Right.
American neighbors. But then also, we do live in God's universal neighborhood, right? The person on the other side of the planet is, in theological terms, my neighbor. Now, I have a first obligation to my wife as a neighbor than some random woman who is also my neighbor, but this one's my wife, right? And then my kids, not all kids. I do have an obligation at some level to all kids, but especially my kids. And beyond that, I have a certain obligation to all countries, but first to my countrymen, to my kinsmen. And so all that being said, in terms of love for neighbor, ironically, even love for our global neighbors, right? So even the weak God's language of inclusivism, we'll hate America, but love, the Sudan. Well, ironically, it would have been better for Afghanistan, better for like every single neighbor in the world if less than 1% of conservative 6 million voters in California had left and voted in one of these states. The whole world would have been more left. So
that leads right into what my guess would be for a Black Swan event would be entering some type of global conflict. Ukraine is looking like they're probably about to lose the war. There was EU talked to Zelensky and they essentially said like, you need to be preparing for peace talks in the new year. And wartime presidents actually generally prove to be generally pretty popular. I think of George W. Bush during the War on Terror.
Actually, I think
he did 2 terms.
I think that a U.S. president has never been voted out of office during a war.
That's what I think as well.
Yep.
Didn't want to say it just in case I'm wrong.
I've read that.
But to enter, for example, the war in Ukraine, we have to do this to push back against Putin. And if you vote for this guy, if you vote for the Republican nominee, we're going to lose all the progress. The world's going to be crushed under an iron curtain again. That might be something. The Middle East, same thing. Like we have to go in there and help out our neighbor. And this guy won't do it. I got your back. Vote for me. Forget, because I mean the economy. You can't even campaign on that. You can't campaign on the economy, on infrastructure.
You mean if you're a Democrat,
right?
Yeah.
If you're Biden, you can't campaign on those things. So what are you going to have to do? Some type of, like you mentioned, an empathy event, a disaster. Because again, all you need is 50,000, 100,000 to be safe. Individuals to stay home. They're reluctant voters.
Right.
Fine, I'll fill out the ballot. Margin's not high.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. So you need some kind of Black Swan event. Here's a couple of I'll throw out my predictions again. No crystal ball. I'm not prophesying here, but just things to look for. And I do think it matters not to scare people, but just for us to be innocent as doves, cunning as serpents, wise. We can't just go in a bunker for 2024 and the rest of our lives indefinitely. So live your life. But live it with courage, but also live it with wisdom and discernment. And so that's all I'm saying. But with that, I have a few. So one, you have COVID 2.0, some kind of medical thing. Right. Because here's the deal. So you got to think, again, as a generalist, you got to think, all right, what's going to be the play? The play is keep Biden, in the White House, or really keep whoever's behind Biden. I'm convinced. I think Biden has literally been dead for at least a couple of years now, and they just have like some kind of like robotronics that like a Roomba that causes him to barely move around the room. So, anyways, they don't even need him alive at this point. It's just like they've been putting lipstick on that corpse for a while. But keep the Dems in the White House, and so how do you do that? Well, you need. I'm just going to say it. You need the peanut gallery of the country to vote. That's how Democrats get in office, right? That's the only way. Democrats get in office by, I'm going to say it, women voting.
If you don't say it, I'll say it.
All right, women voting, the lowest IQ in the country voting, the poorest voting. Basically, you need the people who contribute the least, the people who are most emotional, the people who contribute the least, people who are here illegally, who aren't even citizens. You need the dredge of society to vote. That's how Democrats win elections. Because when people who care about the country vote, if only people who could care about the country could vote, we would have a Republican president always.
Yep.
Democrats cannot win without getting people across the border, without women voting, without one day I think there'll be a play to lower even the age of voting.
That's what they've been talked about.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. They need 14-year-old minority trans girls to vote to win an election, because that's the only person who has the intellectual capacity to think that it would be a good idea to vote for a Democrat. Period. So all that being said, the play is it's an election year. Dems want to stay in office. They need the lowest of the low to vote. So you have to, what do you do? So thinking like a generalist here, what you do is you have to make it easier to vote. So whether it's COVID 2.0, hey, we can't go out because, we got to stop the spread. So you can't go in person, mail in. Mail in is easier than putting on pants, right? Putting on pants, that's something that people with jobs do, right? But, like you don't have time to put on pants in the morning when you've got, a whole Netflix season to binge that day, and collect your unemployment check. So that person doesn't go out to vote. That person mails in a vote. And it's not just that it's easier to mail in than go in and vote. The mail in, here's the thing about the mail in is it allows, you don't even have to fill out the ballots because the same person who won't go, oftentimes that person won't even mail in their vote. But what it allows is for ballot harvesters to go around and go to an apartment complex where they can literally look at the building and say, I know that or go to funded housing, where I know every single one of these people are on welfare. And can I just, hey, you don't want Trump to be president, do you? That guy's a racist. Right, Biden wants to unite the nation, and
they want to take away your benefits.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And he wants to take away your benefits. I'll take it for you. I just need you to sign. And so that's and that's not even including actual machines, straight up, miscounted fraud. And so my point is, what can we expect this year? Anything that would make it. So this is the key. Anything that would make give some kind of logical reason, justification for not going in person, in public to vote. So disease can do that. Here's another one: mass shootings. Right. So FBI, just playing this out again. I'm not prophesying. This is literally just a random example. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but FBI, right, which we know is totally legit. But FBI, they say, well, we've gotten a bunch of, we hacked into, a signal thread, or a bunch of emails that we came across where there's alt-right wing Nazi extremists that have said they're going to be shooting up voting booths, and so. And they would disclose which voting booths, but it's 3 or 4 voting booths.
Could be in these 4 states.
And these, exactly. In this
Georgia,
state, Pennsylvania,
Michigan.
and exactly. These coincidentally, conveniently, and so what we have to do is in these states, we have to, because this is the play. It's always public safety for individual liberty. Public safety for individual.
That's
give
what's
up,
being traded.
Exactly. That's the trade, right? So cost benefit analysis. It's give us your individual liberty. We'll provide your public safety. Yeah. So in those states, I'm sorry, but for the safety of the public, you guys get it, right? We're just looking out for the safety of the public. We're going to have to do all mail-in voting this year. No voting booths, no in-person. And then lo and behold, all the DNC little henchmen come out and they're doing the ballot harvesting. So shootings, medical, COVID 2.0, both of those are easy. So that's what I would be thinking. Now with that, there actually could be some real shootings. Sure. Some real shootings. So I already told my wife, again, living with courage, but also not living with a tinfoil hat, but also not living foolishly. And so I've already told my wife, hey, this year we're going to be a little bit more careful. We're probably in 2024, the way our nation is right now, and with it being an election year, we are probably not going to go to large public events. This is not a year for us to go to some big concert, as an example, or to this or that, because I see this as being, it's been happening for a while now. Some transgender, shooter shoots up a Christian school or something but especially this year. So this year, we're gonna play it a little closer to the chest. We're gonna be a little bit safer. We're still we have our friends, our community. We'll do play dates, go to people's homes and do this, but probably not going to go to a large public event with multiple thousands of people there in the year 2024. So, anyways, what do you think, Wes?
No, that's great. And you got to think of it. At the end of the day, it's not a physical war, it's not a civil war, but there's a very sense in which we're at war for the soul of the West. And it's going to take sacrifice, and it's going to take hard work and diligence. So first ordering your home rightly, and then working to order your church and your community. But that's going to take, no, we're actually not going to go to the water park. We're not going to go to these concerts. Going to take personal sacrifice to fight for the soul of the West. We'll see what happens. The Lord knows. The Lord can bring revival. He even used flawed men like Donald Trump to just invigorate and stir up the will of the people for good so God can use Donald Trump, and we may see a great renewal in this land. But it's going to take so many individual households making sacrifices exactly like you said, to bring their wife home, to have children, to have a job, to work hard, all at a local level.
Lead family worship.
To bring into something more.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And with that, quick plug for, this Sunday, but if anybody's in the Central Texas area, we're in Georgetown, Texas, about 45 minutes outside of Austin. We'd love to have you. Covenant Bible Church. Check it out, covenantbible.org. But we just started last Lord's Day, a new series preaching through the book of Ezra. And this week, Ezra chapter 1 talks about King Cyrus. And a lot of people have likened Trump to Cyrus. Like, it's debatable whether or not Cyrus was actually regenerate. He knew about the Lord. He knew he was the God of heaven, the true King of all kings, those kinds of things. And he recognized that God, the Hebrew God, Yahweh, that he was the true God, God of gods, King of kings, and that he's the one who had sovereignly given to Cyrus the authority and the civil, power that Cyrus had, and that he was supposed to use it in order to empower the people of God, namely the Israelites, to build a house for his name, to go and rebuild the ruins of Jerusalem. And that's where we are right now as a country. It's rebuilding the ruins that we were a Christian nation in many ways. And I think, that right now we're a Christian nation currently in the process of apostasy. We're currently, because of that, we're under God's judgment, and not just under his judgment, but even a stricter judgment because of his many blessings, because of our founding.
Which is the theme of next week's video, by the way.
Great. Awesome.
Living under judgment.
For Wednesday, for the live stream.
Yes.
Great. Living under judgment. Awesome. So next Wednesday, 4 p.m. Central Time, living under judgment. This Sunday, though, if you're anywhere in the Central Texas area and you don't have a solid church home, we would love for you to join us. Go to covenantbible.org. But what I'm going to be talking about is, just like Wes said, is the Cyrus thing, that this civil political leader, like a Caesar type, whether he's regenerate or not, God uses him in his sovereignty, because God directs the heart of a king like many waters. God has a sovereign power over all people, including kings, and uses it for the good of his people, the good of the church. But what's unique that I'm going to be addressing in Ezra chapter 1, the latter part of the chapter this next week, is that Cyrus is not enough. So it says that, the same God who divinely stirred up the heart of Cyrus to do good to the people of God, that they might rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, that same God who inspired Cyrus also inspired Israel, the people of Israel that were currently living in captivity under Cyrus and his rule, but not just the people of Israel in general. There is some sense of that, but specifically targeting leaders in Israel. And there's two primary categories of leaders in Israel that God stirred up their hearts, as well as Cyrus. And it was the Levites and priests. That's one category. And the others were civil and political leaders from Judah. So you have two houses, the house of Levi and the house of Judah, right? The scepter, Jacob even prophesies this with his sons. The scepter, civil rule and leadership, is given to Judah. The priesthood is given to Levi. So what you have basically is this: God stirs up the hearts of politicians and pastors. Politicians and pastors. Cyrus is not enough. The people still have to, Cyrus saying you can go, you may go, you should go, and even resourcing the people of God to go still won't be enough to make them go. They have to want to go. They have to have, and so you need to stir up the people. You've got to have Cyrus giving permission, but you also have to have among your own people, right? So you can have that foreign leader that's outside of the people of God. Right? Like I said, Trump maybe not being regenerate. I would bet on him not being regenerate outside of the people of God, but with this high office and a soft spot for the people of God. So you need that as a part of the equation, but you also need within the people of God your own local leaders, your own heads of tribes, and you need the political leaders that are Christians at a local level. You need your Dusty Deavers, but then you also need the Levites and the priests. You need your spiritual leaders. You need local pastors. And if they're not on board, then the revival, the rebuilding, the resurgence won't happen. And in 2020, slowly boiling frogs in the pot of hot water woke up and jumped out of the pot. Praise God for that. I'm super grateful. But we have, I think we're naive if we say, man, the left, they so overplayed their hand, they done messed up, and now we have this revival. No, we're nowhere near revival. There's a little bit of a pushback. There's a little bit of people waking up and saying, man, I want revival. I want to go all the way back to 2014. Wow, but we're nowhere even close. And here's one of the reasons I would say we're not close is that we had Trump in 2020. before we lost him. But we had Trump in 2020. But then we had David French and Rusell Moore and Tim Keller. And we did not have the Levites and the House of Judah over here.
Yep.
And when that play was used in BLM, we didn't have the pastors or the politicians. The pastors, by and large, they all folded. Yep. They all failed. And I'm not just saying they failed because we had no idea what was going on. They failed for a few weeks. I'm saying they failed for like better part of a year, some of them over a year. And again, I'm not saying some, I'm saying the majority. Even the conservative ones. And so I think we know that that Aslan is on the move, you know, that there's really a work when you have a Cyrus, but who may not be a part of the people of God. He's a foreigner, but God softens his heart to have compassion on his people. So you have a Cyrus, but then you also have not just the Christian prince. In this case, I would call him the Caesar. But then what you have is many Christian princes, not princess. Let me pull out my patriarchy card, but princes, plural, multiple. It's not just one Christian prince, but you have many Christians in politics at a lower level underneath the Caesar, but who are not foreigners, but they're natives. And here's the thing about Zerubbabel. He was one of them. And then also the pastors, the priest and the Levites. And so you got them too. But one of these political leaders, you got Ezra, he's the priest, but on the political side, the Judah, leaders, but native, not a foreigner like Cyrus, but native to Israel. What you have is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel rebuilt the rubbable. All right, so you got Zerubbabel, but here's one of the things of his name, Zerubbabel. What it meant was it was Shesh Bezar, I think, or Bazar. Bazar. Shesh Bazar, I believe, is the name that was given to him by the Babylonians where he was in captivity. And what that name meant was joy in tribulation. So he was a warrior, but he was a jolly warrior. I think that's significant. And then the name Zerubbabel, what all the people said about him and what that name meant was it was stranger. I think it meant stranger in the land or something like that. What it meant was a lot of people had been 70 years at this point, meaning 2 generations, arguably 3, depending how you count, 2.5 and the people had settled in. This is our home now. Zerubbabel, what was said of him, even in his name, is that even though he was born and raised his whole life in captivity in Babylon, that's all that, for all intents and purposes, that is life, that is home. But his whole life, he felt like a stranger. He had a love for his heritage. He did not spurn his heritage. He had read the prophets. He had read Jeremiah. He had read Isaiah. He had read of the days of old, and he wanted Israel. He knew that going to Israel would be costly because you have to rebuild everything. It's going to be work, but I would rather work and have my home, my heritage, my lineage, my history, my forefathers. He had a love for his heritage. And that was one of the big plays through the historians, through the politicians, through movies and Hollywood and media. One of the big plays for the last 60 years was to get white Westerners to hate their heritage, to hate Charlemagne, to hate King Richard the Lionhearted, to hate George Washington and the founders, to hate King Alfred, to hate... And I think that people are starting to wake up, but that's what it'll take. Cyrus, my whole point is to say Cyrus is not enough. Trump is not enough. And Trump, honestly, is I would prefer Cyrus. So that would not be enough. Then you have to have many Christian princes and many Christian pastors. And in 2020, we did not have them.
Maybe we can end with this, but the image is so good of the sword and the trowel. I think it's in Nehemiah. They're building and fighting. So they're not just fighting. It's not just we oppose that. We're just opposed to it. They're building. But while they're building, they're not head in the sand.
That's right.
Boy, I hope nobody comes for us. They're defending their family, but building something up.
That's right. Amen. All right. Well, tune in next week. Just for anybody who's maybe new to the channel, just so you know, we've switched some stuff up. So this year, here's the program. We've got Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So 3 shows every single week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. every single one of those days. It's 4 p.m. Central Time. It'll land on YouTube and Twitter. So you can watch live on Twitter as it airs, or you can watch live on YouTube, and then everything eventually, and not eventually, that makes it sound like a month, within hours goes to our podcast platform. So you can find us on Spotify, on Apple, and then, of course, everything's also on the website. That's rightresponseministries.com. And we have a free app that you can download, whatever app store you use. Just look up Right Response Ministries, and you can download the app. So everything will go to the app and the website. And then within hours, it goes to all your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, whatever. But if you want to watch it live as it's happening at 4 p.m. Central, it's Twitter or YouTube. So Twitter or YouTube, 4 p.m. Central Time, 3 shows a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Monday is what we call Theology Applied, the interview. That's where I do a remote interview with notable guests from all over. We've had Doug Wilson several times, guys like, Brian Sauvé, guys. I've had Aaron Wren on the show. I've had multiple different guys, Michael Foster, A.D. Robles, John Harris, all those guys. And so that's Monday, the interview, 4 p.m. Central Time. Wednesday is the live stream, and that's with Michael and Wes, and we do that every single Wednesday, 4 p.m. And that's live. And so we're going to be addressing current events and news that comes out, like the Aaron Wren article over that book. And so things that are fresh, things that are happening right now, and also some things that aren't, but are pertinent and relevant. And then Friday, 4 p.m. Central Time, that's called The Special. The Friday Special is a season-based show. So instead of just one singular episode, it's a deep dive of anywhere from 8 to 12 episodes, each about an hour, 40, 60 minutes in length. And that's where I bring in, not just remotely, piping in through Zoom or something, but in-house in the studio. I'm going to fly out 2 guys. And right now, the first season, and it's quarterly, so it's going to be 4 seasons this year, Lord willing. One season this quarter, Q1, and then Q2, Q3, and Q4. So from April all the way through March, we've got 9 episodes of the first season of the Friday Special, and the first episode of the first season aired last Friday. And for this whole season, my guests are Andrew Isker and A.D. Robles. And we're talking about Andrew Isker's recent book that he published, The Boniface Option, which is kind of the sword in the trowel, but the first being St. Boniface, the axe. And so cutting down old Donner's Oak, cutting down trash world, clown world, whatever you want to call it, and then building out of the ashes Christendom. New Christendom. And so that's running right now. And a lot of people are watching that. That show's doing really, really well. And it comes out weekly, but it's all pre-recorded. So we've recorded all 9 episodes. And if anybody wants to get an episode ahead of time, be able to not just have to wait weekly every Friday, but binge watch the whole season, you can join our Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Right Response Ministries. Patreon.com/Right Response Ministries. So thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you were blessed by this discussion, and we look forward to seeing you this Friday. Yep.